Okay, well, hello to everyone. Let me get myself, here we go, better. Okay, hello to everybody. Joanne Freeman here again for History Matters, and as always, cleverly disguised coffee cup, so does coffee. And I want to thank you, as Matt suggested earlier, those of you who are tuning in at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, or whenever. I appreciate your joining me here Thursday morning, as always on Thursday mornings, to talk about history, but more specifically, to talk about how we look at the past, what kinds of questions we ask about the past, and how that can inform us and help us ask questions about the present. So it's both of those things at the same time are what I'm doing in these sessions. Today we're going to be talking about diaries, and I will explain why in a minute. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn things briefly over to Matt, who is going to explain important logistical things about asking questions, which will happen at the end of the session today.
Excellent. Yes. So, so thank you, Joanne, and we're all thrilled by this. This is our fourth session, and we're getting the hang of it, and things are going really, really nicely. And I see, it's possible we might even have a Zoom bomber. How wonderful is that? I would also say that I have a couple announcements, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the rules and stuff for today. Sorry, got distracted there for a quick second. So just as a reminder, the History Matters and so does Coffee airs every week on Thursdays. There was an issue with that on Twitter that we noticed, so so mixed up the day, but it is Thursdays at 10. That is Eastern time, so adjust accordingly. I also want to mention that Joanne's keynote from our national conference in March.
Your audio is very low.
Oh, is this better? Check my levels here. Hello?
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties. Can anybody hear me? There we go.
Okay.
Might be a little bit better. So Joanne's keynote from our national conference back in March is now airing on C-SPAN 3. And if you would like a link to that, we've been putting that out on Twitter, and hopefully we will we'll get that up on our website and also on our Facebook page so that you have that information. It's airing about once a day, and then it's also on their website, so you'll be able to see lots of good stuff from her keynote.
About Hamilton.
What's that?
About Hamilton.
About Hamilton, yes, this is about Hamilton. And C-SPAN will remind you of that, from what I understand. They definitely want to remind you that it is about Hamilton. I want to encourage everybody to join the National Council of History Education. You can go to nche.net and join our organization. You get lots of great stuff and lots of great content like this. If you do like this kind of stuff and you are deeply embedded into what history is, I do want to mention that we do have a webinar tonight. An up-and-coming historian by the name of Anne Lady M. McDivitt is going to be doing her webinar on the history of the gaming industry of the 1970s, 1980s, and its role in how the gaming world was developed. And so it's a prescient for kind of the things that are going on today, and hopefully you'll find that interesting and you'll join us tonight. That's all I have. So rules for today are pretty straightforward. Yes, we want to avoid the Zoom bombing if we possibly can. We also do have the opportunity to ask questions, and so you put those in the Q&A. I'll answer the ones I can, or excuse me, I'll pick the ones that I can to ask. I won't answer them. I mean, I could, but the answers would be vastly different from what Joanne might put out there. So we'll do that at the end. Usually Joanne likes to talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for questions. We'll go about 45 minutes today. So with that, I will shut up and let Joanne have her get back to it. So thank you, everybody.
Okay. Everybody, today we are talking about diaries. This makes me happy. I'm going to be sharing with you a diary that I particularly love. But before we plunge into that diary, I want to talk a little bit about why I pick diaries and what I think that can help us discover. Now, if you think about it, so far we've looked at what was probably a personal or private memorandum, but talking about formal political events. We looked at a letter of testimony by 3 former congressmen. We looked at a partial draft of a bill in Congress. In a sense, those are all somewhat conventional kinds of sources of evidence, although every kind of evidence has questions you need to ask about it before you just take what it's saying as gospel truth. But diaries, in a way, are a little bit less orthodox as a kind of source, a little bit trickier to use, but they have really useful and sometimes really hard to glean information in them. Now, for the kind of history that I do, they're really handy, right? I'm a political historian, but I'm particularly interested in political culture. And so really the culture of politics, the tone of it, the language of it, the logic of it, the tools of it, the mental landscape of it, right? The sort of ways in which people are engaging in and experiencing politics. And I'm particularly interested in looking at elite politicians because we don't normally look at them that way, right? We look at them as special people. Like, we shall look at these special people. I'm not looking at them as special people. I'm acknowledging they're elite. But what I'm interested in is, what can you tell about the behavior of and the nature of the government by watching this elite group engage in politics and looking at what they assume and what they're thinking? So those are the kinds of questions that really get me interested and excited. And diaries, obviously, are a great place to get that kind of information, assuming you use them correctly. Now, as a person interested in culture, I will say that I think an important part of it, and that's true, I'm going to mention 2 diaries today. That's true when you use a diary. I don't think it's particularly useful when you're looking to get a sense of something, to dip in and read, oh, this was April, goodbye. I don't think you can dip in and out of diaries that way and really get a sense of a culture. I think you kind of have to immerse yourself in sources, which is what I like to do before I begin writing, is just try and capture the feel and the sense and the language of something by immersing myself in it for a while and almost not necessarily asking questions, just kind of absorbing. For the book that I just, semi-just published, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, I was writing about Congress. And there were certainly a lot of biographies and other such things I could read, but I wanted to understand what it felt like to be in Congress. So I spent actually an entire year of leave sitting in my desk chair, reading the period's equivalent of the congressional record. Just sort of, in that case, dipping in and out, get a sense of what interested people, what seemed to upset people, what did they talk about at length, what got them mad at each other. I mean, just reading and taking notes on what it felt like and what it sounded like, and sort of getting, in my gut, a sense of what that felt like, and then going back and asking questions and thinking more broadly and reading other kinds of sources. But that's one of the ways in which I think diaries are really useful. Now, today I'm going to be talking about a favorite diary. The bad news is that my copy of my favorite diary is not with me in my current lockdown location, which I realized, 2 days ago. It's like, oh, I love this diary. I don't have it with me. Luckily, it's a somewhat well-known one. There are versions of it available online. I'm going to come back to that shortly because the version matters. I am going to show you briefly a substitute diary just to acknowledge that you can delve deeply into these. So this is the diary of Benjamin Brown French, who is at the center of the book I just published. Obviously, it's written all over. It has lots of Post-it notes in it, and I used it so much that at a certain point, it just disintegrated. And that was the point at which I realized I should probably finish my book. But at any rate, diaries are amazing sources. Today, we're going to be looking at the diary of someone who was a senator in the first Congress. So right when the national government launches in 1789, and he is there through 1791. And as you're going to hear, I'm going to read a few portions of it today. And I don't necessarily always read things, but this requires reading, I think, because of the richness of it. But it has a lot in it about the reality of being in that place at that time as a member of that government, watching people figure out what this government should be, looking at their assumptions about what they thought it should or shouldn't be, and watching them work that out, again, on a ground level. The guy whose diary we're going to be looking at, senator from Pennsylvania, his name is William Maclay. Not necessarily the most well-known person from the founding period or member of Congress, but he's wonderful because of this diary. And without this diary, there's a lot about the early Senate that we wouldn't know. So this ends up becoming important for formal reasons, in addition to the sort of informative cultural reasons that I tend to love to look at it for. Now, it's important to think when you're looking at a diary, and this is maybe not an obvious question, is to ask, what do you mean by diary when you say you're looking at one? And by that, I mean, diaries aren't always the same thing to everyone at every time. They have different meanings. You know, I think we assume a diary is, you know, private document. I'm sure, I think when I was 14, I had the kind of diary with like the little lock on the cover and sort of vinyl covers, probably pink. We assume the diaries are private, and we get mad when our brothers find our diaries and snoop in them, and endless TV shows and movies somehow have that scene in them. So we assume that diaries are private and kind of confessional. They're not always that way. So sometimes a diary might just be a record, right? It might just be a record of daily events and, you know, the temperature, what a person did, who a person saw. It might not be confessional at all. Or sometimes it might be, I forgot where I was going, guys. There's a lot of technical difficulties today. At any rate, my point is, it's confessional, it's a record. Diaries can be any number of different things. Maclay's diary, and this is why I'm bringing this up in the first place, Maclay's diary is kind of an interesting blend. So on the one hand, as you're going to hear, he's being confessional in some ways. He's also recording things that have happened, and he kind of wants it to be a record of what he's doing and what he's seeing in the first Congress. You won't necessarily hear this from what I'm offering today, but when you read through the diary, you realize that he's assuming that at some point his constituents might want to know what the heck he was doing in the Senate, or what was going on, or why he did what he did. And he's assuming that this diary, he could take it with him and he can flip to the right page and say, well, on this day we discussed this and here's what I thought. He even layers in formal documents in the diary, right, to have a record of things if he needs to refer to them. So his diary is an interesting blend of public and private. It's really important to think about those kinds of things when you're picking up a diary, because what you're doing is thinking about the audience, right? Who is the intended audience? In his case, in his diary, I don't think he's ever assumes he's going to hand it to someone and say, hey, go ahead and read my diary. And you'll hear there are many ways in which there are things in here, many things in here he would not want people to see, but parts of it are public. Okay, so I want to talk just really briefly about why it's one of my favorite diaries. And it has to do with, I suppose, the diary-like aspects of it, the more private aspects of it. Maclay, he almost never misses a day in all the time he's in Congress, 89 to 91. And he writes a lot of things down. So it's not just so-and-so stood up and debated today and so-and-so disagreed and I ate dinner with someone else. He writes about the snack foods that the senators are eating around him. I think there's one day he notes that they're eating oranges and cakes or something. He notes in his diary that he heard someone whisper that John Adams needed his wig dressed, right? His wig is looking kind of sloppy. He records some of his dreams. He talks about the little gifts that he gives to his kids. He talks about everything. So if you're trying to get a sense of the feel for a moment, granted, this is one person's point of view and one particular kind of person's point of view, but that evidence, that kind of insight is hard to get. So I love Maclay's diary because he's very present in it, and he lets you look through his eyes in certain ways, and in a way that, and you're going to hear, that makes what's happening appear more real and human, and sort of makes him seem human as well. I'm going to come back to that. What I want to do is read you a couple passages from the diary so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about, and why I love this diary. And I'll point out a few things in between, and then I'll come back and we can talk about what we just heard. So let me get the diary here. Okay, so I'm going to read a brief passage first, and then a slightly longer one that is timely in a way, and that I was not savvy enough to plan it as being timely. But the first little passage that I want to read. So Maclay, he's in the Senate. He's sitting there. It's actually April 24th, 1789. And everyone is obsessed with how do you inaugurate a president? What happens when you inaugurate a president? What do you do? What do you not do? What are the details? There hasn't ever been a president before. What does it mean? So already these are interesting questions, and he's recording what it's like to be there when they're debating those questions. So on April 24th, he notes that John Adams, vice president and president of the Senate, one day brings up this question. He says, what happens when President Washington enters the Senate for his inauguration? He's going to be the president, but I'm the president of the Senate. And so this is what Maclay writes. What shall I be? Adams asks. I'm not the president if he's the president, but am I still the president? And Maclay writes, Adams threw himself back in his chair and, quote, God forgive me for it was involuntary, Maclay writes, but he laughed at it. Maclay then watches as what he calls a solemn silence comes over the room, right? Adams says, what shall I be when the president is in the room? And the room gets quiet, I suppose, except for Maclay stifling his little giggle. We don't know. What's the answer? Maclay describes a senator who begins to thumb through the Constitution to see if there's an answer to the question in the Constitution. Think about that for a moment, right? That moment and where they are in figuring things out, that's the level. Does the Constitution offer any evidence? So this senator gets up, he thumbs through the Constitution, and then at length he reports, quote, with the most profound gravity, that where the Senate is to be, then, sir, you must be at the head of them. But further, sir, and then Maclay writes in parentheses, here he looked aghast, as if some tremendous gulf had yawned before him. I shall not pretend to say. And I read it like that because he puts a comma after every word, Maclay, to indicate that, right, I shall not pretend to say, right? This is solemn, this statement. I read that partly because it's just really captures the moment that we're in and what it felt like. I also mention it because it's important when you're looking at any document, and particularly diaries, to think about what edition of it you're using. Maclay's diary is not obscure, and it began to be published in the 19th century. But the 19th century version is edited initially by a descendant of his. So this person kept some things out, didn't include things he didn't think were important, and other editions did the same thing. When I looked online, since my copy of the diaries back somewhere else, what I discovered is that less than modern, so older editions, they take the commas out of that sentence, which destroys the whole meaning of it, right? Maclay is making fun of the sort of gravity of it. And other editors thought, why are all the commas there? They're wrong, and took them out. That sort of thing happens all the time. So modern editions are important if you can find them, and if they're you know them to be reliable. In the case of Maclay's diary, the modern edition by the first Congress project that was at George Washington University, theirs is the sort of sterling one I used in my work, and that I don't have. Okay, now I want to go on. And I'm going to talk about April 30th, 1789. This is why I'm timely, and I didn't intend to be timely. So yesterday I saw on Twitter people saying, on this day in 1789, George Washington was inaugurated president, which is true. And I'm going to be talking about the inauguration, but I didn't think to myself, let's look at the date and line up. I lined up nothing. I just thought, after 3 kinds of sources, today is a day to get a less conventional source. It's a diary. Maclay's the one I'm going to use, and the inauguration passage is good. But I shouldn't have said that. I should have just acted brilliant. Okay, at any rate, I want to read parts of it. I'm going to read, it's not huge, but it's a little bit lengthy because it's just kind of amazing, the stuff it shows. So April 30th, 1789, that's the day that Washington's going to get inaugurated. Maclay writes in his diary, Thursday, this is the great important day. Goddess of etiquette, assist me while I describe it. Okay, already he's kind of tongue-in-cheek. The Senate stood adjourned to half after 11 o'clock. He then describes how he put on his best clothes, went to find a friend who wasn't there, and then went into Congress Hall. The crowd already great. The Senate met. The Vice President, Adams, rose in the most solemn manner. This son of Adam seemed impressed with deep gravity. Yet, what shall I think of him? He often, in the midst of his most important airs, I believe when he is at a loss for expressions, and this he often is, wrapped up, I suppose, in the contemplation of his own importance, Maclay does not like Adams, suffers an unmeaning kind of vacant laugh to escape him. And this was the case today, and really to me bore the air of ridiculing the farce he was acting. Gentlemen, I wish for the direction of the Senate, Adams asks. The president will, I suppose, address the Congress. How shall I behave? How shall we receive him? Shall it be standing or sitting? Right, so, okay, the president is going to come in, and what do we do? What do I do? Do we stand for him? Do we sit for him? That sort of thing matters, right? If they stand, are they treating him in a monarchical way? Are they treating him like a king? If they sit, are they not showing him enough respect? What does all of this mean? Everything has a meaning, and that's part of what you get in Maclay's diary, a political meaning, and thus they have to ponder and debate everything to the point of, and even Maclay is saying, the ridiculous. So Maclay goes on. Here followed a considerable deal of talk from Adams, which I could make nothing of. Mr. Lee began with the House of Commons, as is usual with him, then the House of Lords, then the King, and then back again, right? So here's someone who's like, well, what do they do in England? The result of his information was that the Lords sat and the Commons stood on the delivery of the King's speech. Mr. Izard got up and told how often he had been in the House of Parliament and said a great deal about what he had seen there. Okay, what do we do with the president? I don't know, but I've seen Parliament. Let me tell you what it looked like. They don't know. But then Izard makes this sagacious discovery that the Commons stood when the King made his speech because they had no seats to sit on because they were in the House of Lords. So the room is like, perhaps the Commons, perhaps the House of Representatives should stand and the Senate should sit when the president enters the room. It's what they do when the King gives a speech. And then the senator says, yeah, they do it because the House of Commons doesn't have chairs. So everyone's like, oh, okay, we can't take that example. And they then go on. They begin again discussing Parliament, how often they'd been there, the fact that there was always such a crowd and there were ladies along, and that they couldn't quite even see what it was like. So why are they even turning to that anyway? Mr. Carroll got up to declare that he thought it of no consequence how it was in Great Britain, how there were no rule to us. That's an important point. Are we supposed to be acting like that? I think we're not supposed to be acting like that. But all at once, the secretary, who had been out, whispered to the chair that the clerk from the representatives, the House of Representatives, was at the door with a communication. Adams asks the Senate, gentlemen of the Senate, how shall the clerk be received? Right? New question. What does it mean? Do we let him in? Do we not let him in? Does he get accompanied by our clerk? Does he walk in on his own? Should he come in at all? We don't know. And they have this lengthy debate, which I will not read. And at the end of it, Maclay writes in his diary, although not in the version that's online, but in the actual diary, he writes, this is an endless business. Which just captures so wonderfully so many things about that moment. He then describes the president entering. The president advanced, between the Senate and representatives, bowing to each. He was placed in the chair by the vice president, the Senate, with their president on the right, the speaker, and the representatives on his left. The vice president rose and addressed a short sentence to him. The import of it was that he should now take the oath of office as president. Thank you very much. He seemed to have forgot half of what he was to say, Adams, for he made a dead pause and stood for some time to appearance in a vacant mood, like he forgot what he was supposed to say. He finished with a formal bow, and the president was conducted out of the middle window into the gallery, and the oath was administered by the chancellor. Notice that the business done was communicated to the crowd by proclamation, who gave three cheers and repeated it on the president's bowing to them, right? He thinks this might be important, I'm putting it in my diary. As the company returned into the Senate chamber, the president took the chair and the senators and representatives their seats. So they're all sitting. He rose and all arose and addressed them. Okay, so now the president is now addressing Congress. And this is kind of touching, and I'll end with this. This great man was agitated and embarrassed more than ever he was by the leveled cannon or pointed musket. He trembled and several times could scarce make out to read, though it must be supposed he had often read it before. He put part of the fingers of his left hand into the side of what I think the tailors call the fall of the breeches, which is kind of where your side pocket is, changing the paper into his right hand. After some time, he did the same with some of the fingers of his right hand, putting the speech into his left hand. When he came to the words, all the world, he made a flourish with his right hand, which left rather an ungainly impression. I sincerely, for my part, wished all set ceremony in the hands of the dancing masters, and that this first of men had read off his address in the plainest manner, without ever taking his eyes from the paper, for I felt hurt that he was not first in everything. Okay, that's kind of touching. Now let's talk for a minute. Move this out of the way. Let's talk for a minute about what we saw there. Right, there's all kinds of amazing stuff about what it felt like, about what the Senate seemed worried about by our standards and even by Maclay's standards, the ridiculousness of that discussion, and yet it's important, which is why they're having it, right? So they're kind of stuck. So you get a sense of what I always like to refer to when I'm talking about the launching of the government, the improvisational nature of it. They're making it up as they go. There isn't a modern republic in the sense that the United States was founding one, so they really don't know what to do. And then you get a sense of this room with some men who see themselves as very self-important, and others. Maclay is certainly not the only one sitting there wondering what's going to happen, what should we do, isn't he ridiculous, he needs his wig dressed, right? You just get a sense of some bit of the reality of that moment through the eyes of Senator William Maclay. And it's important, again, to remember that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that for a moment here, because you can't, just like you can't read a letter and take it for granted wholesale. I think that first week someone asked me about how can you tell what's real or not real, what's believable or not believable in letters, and a lot of it depends on all the details. Where was the person when he or she wrote it? Who were they writing to? Was it a friend? Did they drop it in the mail or send it by messenger? There are all of these things you have to think about when you're evaluating that kind of a source. And that's just as true for a diary. You have to think about some of the things I said at the beginning. But even after thinking about those things, diaries can fool you. And this one fooled me. I was kind of stunned. So in my first book, Affairs of Honor, it begins with a chapter using Maclay's diary as my main source. So I tortured it like I did Benjamin Brown French's diary, and I wrote all over it, and I read it, and I thought about it, and wrote in that book about it. So I knew it really well. And I knew Maclay through his diary, right? That was how I got to know him. And the man you see in the diary is kind of Spartan and insecure and kind of dour and thinks nobody thinks very much of him. You get a sense of this sort of self-conscious, sort of plain guy who's, sort of feeling his way through, but feels like no matter what he does, he's a failure. That was my image of William Maclay. Then towards the end of writing that chapter, I came across a letter from someone who described meeting Maclay. And he says, and he's a young man, and he says in the letter, I didn't know what to do when I met him. I mean, he's such a grand man and his clothes were so impressive. And it was sort of like lightning bolt, right? I suddenly realized I know Maclay as he presented himself in his diary. That's not necessarily how other people saw him. And those are the sorts of things you have to think about when you're looking at evidence, when you're evaluating evidence, when you're getting information. What are you getting? And what do you need to evaluate so that you're really thinking about the things that might not be wholly accurate? And in this case, he presented a person in his diary who maybe he internally felt himself to be. That's not necessarily how other people experienced him. So you can see in this case, if you're studying the early Republic, just this one man's diary, even though it's one man and he's an elite white guy from Pennsylvania, it does offer you a kind of deeper cultural knowledge that's valuable and that you need to sort of hold in place as you read more widely and try and get a sense of what a period is like. You also have to think about silences. You have to think about not only what's there, but what isn't there. Pretty much it's elite white men in this diary. So if you really want to understand how women are experiencing that moment, how anyone who isn't white is experiencing that moment, Maclay's diary is not the place to go. So you have to think about what's there, you have to think about what isn't there. These are all sort of good historian questions. And I have one more point I'm going to make, and then I'm going to open it to questions. I want to segue and talk a little bit about why I chose this topic and what that tells us about today. What brought this topic to my attention was the fact that we're seeing increasingly on TV testimonies by nurses and doctors, and now some of the other people out working in the world, people working at grocery stores and delivering food. We're seeing their first person testimony. They're often talking directly to their own camera and then sending that footage into a news station. They're testifying, often sitting in a hospital, about what they see and what they hear and what it feels like. Some of them are crying, right? Some of them are emotional. And I remember as our current crisis began unfolding, I felt like the public, no one's going to get a real sense of what this is like. They get numbers and they get rules and they get big, broad ideas, but how are people going to really understand the meaning of this? It's easy to overlook it. And I actually was on Twitter saying, like, we need frontline information, right? We need people on the scene testifying personally about what they see and hear. And sure enough, when that happened, at least some people, and I'm one of them, came away having a real gut feeling for some of what was going on out in the world. So I think it's a great example in a sense that that's the equivalent of a diary. And you can think about what you see in that sort of stuff when you're watching it on TV, and think about the kind of knowledge it gives you, and think about what we would know or not know without it. So I raise that because when you're given information, and particularly in politics, when you're given formal, official information, sometimes partisan information, think really carefully about what is there and what is not there, and what would happen if you spoke to someone who wasn't an official, but was witnessing things in a different way. Think about the sources of your evidence. Think about what you're not seeing as well as what you're seeing, and allow that to help you evaluate what's going on. And I think in this moment, that's vital. I think as we watch these nurses and doctors talk about what they see and hear, that might not be true everywhere. It might be something that's only true in a hospital in New York or San Francisco, but regardless, those are the equivalents of Maclay's diary: subjective, personal, and revealing in a way that a lot of other evidence isn't. Okay, I am going to silence myself there. I went on a little longer than normal because I couldn't resist reading from the diary. Hopefully you can see why I love that diary and talking about that diary. But now I shall open things. Oh, I shall open these to questions, but before we begin, because I'll forget, the mug. I hope you realize that sooner or later I'm going to run out of mugs. I'm going to be online like ordering mugs. I don't have enough mugs to sustain this, but for today, it's my George Washington mug. I have a George Washington mug. And That is my thematic mug for the day. Okay, now I will.
Apropos for the president entering and the president of the Senate not knowing what to do.
Precisely.
I love
Now I
it.
shall turn things over to you, Matt, and we can answer questions.
That's great. Actually, I'm going to be a little self-indulgent here because I have a question.
Okay.
Not in here, but I think it's really germane to what you're talking about. What struck me when I was listening to you reading the passages was the voice, right? That sort of sense of who you're writing to, who is that anonymous entity that, and we do this when we write, whether it's a book that we're writing to for academic purposes or whatever, or
Your volume went down. Technical difficulties. This means we're official, right? If we're having technical difficulties.
Yes, I think this is official.
Okay.
I will change apparently my microphone is dying, so I'm going to have to get a different one.
The voice.
But this idea of voice, like we have this sort of anonymous entity in our heads when we write. And that's true of things that are going to be published and things that we write privately. So I wondered, what do you make of the voice or the audience for whom he's writing? Is he writing for his posterity? Is he writing for like this sort of part of himself that that nobody else gets to see? Like what do you think? What did you make of that? Is the question? Because is that a fair question?
Oh yeah, no, it is. And the question of why he wrote it is an important part of answering it. And as I suggested, and I didn't go into detail at the outset, his diary is a little quirky because parts of it are clearly intended to prove something to the public, and parts of it he really is not intending the public to see. I don't think he intended anyone to read it. There's just too much personal information in there of a sort that I don't think anybody would really be excited for people to see. So I think he intended it to be a personal record. In some cases, he begins to write in Latin so that people around him can't read what he's saying. So he certainly doesn't want people around him to be.
That's awesome.
But he thinks that people might need the information in it. So I took it after investigating what it was and why he wrote it and learning about him. The voice I took to be not for posterity necessarily, but him kind of recording his thoughts with an awareness that he'd be flipping through this in front of people on other occasions, but not, I don't think he was putting on a great mask. It doesn't read that way. And there's too many weird personal details in there for me to think, I know his knee really bothered him a lot. To assume that he meant this for a lot of other people to read.
That's fascinating because, when we write diaries, we always think about, a lot of times it's just a document so you can go back yourself someday and think about, this is what it was like in this time for me, with this idea that nobody else is going to read it. But at the same time, we have all this evidence now. These diaries have been passed down for years and years and years and published in different ways. And so we have these really great, unique insights, but that voice always comes out, which I love.
And he was clearly also processing things for himself in that diary, right? So you can have multiple reasons for writing a diary. You just have to, when you're using them as evidence, you have to consider them and evaluate them.
That's great. And thank you to the audience for allowing me to be a little self-indulgent, asking a question of my own. Great questions that we have here. The first one kind of piggybacks on that, which is that were there any other diary accounts of some of these events from other members of Congress that that you're aware of that might lend different perspectives to this?
There aren't accounts like this of the first Senate in diary form. So this is a valuable document for that reason. But there certainly are, in almost any period, diaries of one kind or another. Sometimes there are other diaries I remember reading in the founding period that sometimes were very revealing, but capture, a couple days riding through South Carolina. The odds that you're going to find a diary describing something important, probably if you dug around a lot, maybe you could find something for someone who witnessed the inauguration, but finding that would be a little needle and haystackish. There are other diaries, and certainly in the course of my writing that first book, I rummaged for as much personal evidence that I could find. The first Federal Congress project that did the modern edition, their job was in part collecting everything written by or to or about that first Congress from the time period. So for me that was my dissertation, that first book. For me as a grad student working on my dissertation, I didn't have to ask that kind of question. There was stuff there, but there's always potentially more, again, by certain people, not by other certain people. Part of the trick of writing history is knowing when to stop, knowing when you don't have enough evidence, and then knowing when you have enough to be representative, and then you should stop. My tendency is to keep going endlessly because I love researching. This is not good. And my graduate advisor, Peter Onuf, he had a number of things he would say to me, and one of them was, you have enough. You can say the rest another time. Okay, I shall now stop writing. But so there's always stuff out there, and there are other kinds of personal, private-ish sources that you could get to.
That's fantastic. Tim Johnson asks, is one value of a diary that it gives us in a fairly raw or unfiltered form a sense of the contingent?
Well, that's a really good question, especially since we started out by talking about contingency. And
that's
now,
why I asked it.
we don't know what's going on, and the historical characters we're looking at do not know what's coming next. Yeah, I do think that's part of it. I mean, you know, I'm really interested in my research in emotions. What are the shoulds and should nots of politicians in this period? And diaries are places where you get that kind of information, how people are responding to the moment, and what scares them or doesn't scare them. And some of that is entirely wrapped up in contingency. So yeah, anything that helps you take yourself out of the present moment, at least to a little bit of a degree that you can think somewhat about a past viewpoint, that's important. We can never absolutely recreate the past. We can never absolutely understand how people in the past understood or saw things, but we can get bits of it. Mm-hmm. And contingency is vital in putting that kind of idea together. And obviously diaries are a great place to get that kind of evidence.
Joe Phillips asks, when you come across something that seems too personal or too weird, and those are in quotation marks, is there a tendency to hold back from sharing it?
Ooh, interesting question.
Or, yeah.
I guess it depends on what it is and if it's important. I guess part of the answer is I do, when I'm using people's words, I don't edit them necessarily because I'm embarrassed for them, but you can't help but feel something about the kinds of things you're quoting from them, mm-hmm. right? And so, you know, if Maclay said something really miserable and nasty, I might quote it and I would feel a little bad quoting it, right? Benjamin Brown French has some really nasty racist things in that diary. I quote one of them. I felt bad quoting it because it's a miserable, nasty, racist thing, but it also, that racism is important, right? So I needed to record it. I think it's important on the one hand to connect with what you're writing about in some kind of a way, and it's equally important to allow for distance. I get very emotionally engaged, surprise, with the people and things I write about. And actually in writing Field of Blood, I had an experience very much that was this sort of an experience, asked this sort of question. And it reminded me of the degree to which I actually needed to be a little bit more sensitive. I was looking for fights in Congress, and I was using a diary and also the congressional record. And what I noticed, I found this one congressman, really bad behaving congressman, always getting in fights. I was like singing hosannas because it was like, excellent, I've got evidence. I've got this guy and he behaves badly all the time. And I'm recording the notes and I'm like, you know, privately thrilled that I found this bad behaving congressman, and then he vanishes from the record.
Wow.
So, right, always right. I thought, uh-oh, first of all, am I in trouble? And secondly, where did he go? So I do a little bit of research, and what I discover is he had a really serious drinking problem and he killed himself.
Oh my gosh.
And that gave me pause for a long time. And that made me rethink what I was thinking and assuming about the people I was writing about. And then I felt really foolish for the way I had been thinking about it. It was an important reminder. Even now, it kind of spooks me a little bit. I feel bad about how I was treating that evidence. So these are important questions that I think, as a historian or someone using primary evidence, it's good to ask yourself.
We're running a little bit long, but then there's fantastic questions. But like, there's a great question about, you mentioned Maclay didn't like Adams. What did he think of Washington, and how could you tell?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. Well, he deeply respected Washington. At some point in the diary, he calls him just the first man, right? He doesn't even have a name. He appreciates the fact that Washington is walking, I think at one point he calls it a tightrope, of trying to be elegant enough to seem as though he's the ruler or, you know, the leader of a country, but not so formal that he seems like a king. And Maclay appreciates that. He's a little daunted by him. In his diary, he tends to get a little befuddled around him. There's a certain point where he makes an awkward bow in front of Washington, and he does what we all do, right? Oh man, like I keep my bow in front of Washington, and I think so much of him. So you definitely get a sense that he reveres him. But as the quote that I read, the passage that I read indicates, he expects a lot out of him and is very frequently disappointed because Washington does things that are not necessarily brilliant, admirable, smart, but for sure he admires him.
Okay, wow, that's amazing. All right, so one last question, and then we'll call it a day, which is from Tom, and I'm going to go with just Tom for right now. Okay. My sense is that notable people today don't leave behind diaries, notes, papers, etc., as much as their counterparts of the past. Do you think, and actually this is actually interesting because our executive director was asked a similar question to this last week during an interview, and I'm going to throw, I know Grace is here, so I'm going to just mention that we answer these kinds of questions a lot. Do you think that that is true? And if so, will that pose difficulties for historians in the future?
The fact that we don't necessarily have
diaries and notes and papers quite as much as our counterparts in the past.
Well, you know, when you're working at a time that isn't modern, you think about the kinds of evidence you do or don't have a lot, right? So I have diaries, which is great. On the other hand, I don't know really what these people sounded like. I can only see what they looked like through other people. If no one wrote it down, it's gone. You know, what I think about people working in the 19th century when there's so much more paper evidence and steam-powered printing presses and, you know, all kinds of stuff so that there's more written down. And I think, wow, you know, they have so much. In the 19th century, most of my stuff, maybe newspapers are printed, but a lot of it's handwritten. And then I think about the 20th and 21st centuries. And I think about the fact that now, you know, you have things that are filmed and things that are on TV and things that are in podcasts and things that were filmed with people's phones, or you have all kinds of evidence that you might not have had before. But you're right, there are other kinds of evidence that vanish. And it's a question. Many years ago, I worked at the Library of Congress. I mean, was employed by the Library of Congress. And I remember there was a meeting in the manuscript division. And they were talking about what they should be collecting now, because, in the manuscript division, it's a lot of political figures and presidents and congressmen, Library of Congress. The question was, what are we collecting, right? Correspondence is different in nature. There's a lot of phone calling happening. How do we have evidence of phone calls? And it was a fascinating discussion to me because it was a formal, official kind of conversation about what are we saving and what does it mean, what we do and don't have? What does it mean for what is recorded and preserved? And then what does it mean for what people will think about the period that we're saving things from? So it's a really important question. And it's one of the questions I think no matter what you're studying, it's smart to ask. It's always smart to ask, what am I seeing and what am I not seeing, right? Whether you're looking at a diary or whether you're just thinking about forms of evidence, asking what's not there or what you're not seeing and thinking if there are ways to get at it can be a really important way to get at something that's not so easy to find and that has value to it. And that's kind of where I ended up with my comments on the present, right? It's really easy to sit back and read a newspaper and watch TV and then say, oh, I'm caught up on the news. Well, no, you're caught up on what the reporter thought was important and what the person speaking on TV wanted you to know, period.
Right.
So now, you know, if you really want to know what happened, look around a little bit, find other kinds of sources and begin to put together a bigger picture so you can understand better for yourself what's going on or what you can tell about it.
That's wonderful. I think that's a great place to end for the day.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's really, really, really helpful. I'm going to let you close it out. And again, just thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
I will close it out. I will say basically next week, we're going to be talking about the everyday. There won't be an online source. There will be sort of, I have a lot of sort ofs here, but at any rate, we're going to be talking about the value of the everyday and what that tells you about history and people. And again, what it shows you that you might not otherwise get and who it shows you that you might not otherwise get. In the meantime, I hope that you will all come back and join me next Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. I hope you will continue to bring friends, classes, relatives, neighbors, bring whoever. You know, this is, I intentionally aim these discussions at as broad an audience as I can, teachers and students and just any member of the public and historians and grad students. Come one, come all. So I hope I see a lot of you next week. And in the meantime, stay safe.